Hi, and welcome to the ARCO Forum of Public Affairs. My name is Erin Ashwell, and I'm a junior here at the college, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the Institute of Politics. The Institute was founded in 1966 by the friends and family of President John F. Kennedy as a living memorial to the fallen president. The Institute has a twofold mission: to inspire youth to careers in politics and public service, and to bridge the gap between academia and politics. On that note, I think tonight's topic is particularly worthwhile. It has become a cliche that technology is changing our society and we're having a hard time keeping up. That's the cliche. But on the other hand, people in our generation are used to getting their email instantly. We're used to getting breaking news off of the internet. And we like to have everything at our fingertips. But the problem is that government is not keeping up with this expectation. Government is big, bulky, it's far away, it's not tangible, and this can be seen in declining youth political involvement. We're lucky then tonight to have a wonderful panel of experts here to talk about the changes in information technology and how government is going to have to adapt. Our moderator tonight is Phil Noble. He's a fellow here at the Institute of Politics, and he's starting the Downloading Democracy project. Mr. Noble started Politics Online, which is an internet resource for funding in politics and public affairs. Mr. Noble started Phil Noble and Associates, which has 20 years worth of experience in public affairs consulting and over 300 consultants. So pleased to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. We struggled a little bit with the title of this, and we have officially changed the title. It's no longer Information is in Revolution is the Government Ready. The title is Generation X to the Government. Get real. And I think that's really what this is about. We have a big disconnect that's either here or coming between Generation X and the government, between people who have two very different ways of dealing with issues and information. A number of things are clear. One is I'm not Generation X, and y'all are. Or at least XY maybe.
Thank you, Phil.
You're welcome. But these folks are really three extraordinary people. Andre Cherney, who's on my right, is the author of a book called The Next Deal. He graduated from Harvard College, and he wrote an article on the Clinton re-election landslide for the Crimson. And somehow Clinton figured it out, saw it, and a week after graduation, he was a senior speechwriter for Al Gore, which says there is hope for getting a real job real quick. Andre, he wrote the Democratic Platform last year, and he started his career when he was 12 after being inspired by reading Teddy White's book about the making of the president. He went on to work for Mike Dukakis. Meredith Bagby, again, is another graduate from Harvard. She is a frequent commentator on Generation X and the Internet Revolution. Her first book was the first annual report on the United States, which she wrote, and I want you to tell us about that later. That came out before she graduated from Harvard. And then her second book, it's got the greatest title I've seen this month. It's called We've Got Issues, the Get Real, No BS, Guilt-Free Guide to What Really Matters. I commend it to you. And also Andre's book. They told me you normally don't sort of hype people's books, but these guys are just getting started, so they hadn't got rich yet. So we'll hype their books. Here's their books. The third is Sylvia Matthews. Sylvia is also from here at Harvard. All you guys came from Harvard. I mean, don't we have any real normal people out here?
Very normal.
Thank you. Sylvia was Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Previous to that, she was Deputy Chief of Staff for President Clinton. and she also served as Robert Rubin's chief of staff. Lots of things you can say about Sylvia. You know, people often get accused of leaving government and cashing in on their sort of expertise. We want to sort of congratulate Sylvia. She's leaving here and she's going to work for one of these really struggling little nonprofits that's trying to change the world. It's called the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So we commend you for that. Hey, where's your book? You don't have a book here.
I'm feeling a loss.
Right. Part of what we want to do is make this sort of as informal as possible. We're going to begin with each of the folks giving a few minutes about their perspective on this issue. And then once we sort of get through that, feel free. There are microphones here. Feel free to just interject. There's also a microphone up there. I'm not sure there are any folks up there. Yeah, there's some folks up there. But this is a little less formal than most of the forum programs are. So, Andre, give us your take on life. What is the next deal?
Well, that's a good question. First of all, let me thank, first of all, the Institute of Politics for putting this forum together, Ann Aaron and Kathy McLaughlin and Bill White and everybody who worked so hard to make this forum possible. I walked into Kathy McLaughlin's office, who's the executive director of the Institute of Politics, walked into her office freshman week of Harvard, and other than a few visits to the dining hall, basically walked out 4 years later. So this is really a homecoming for me, so it's good to be back. The next deal is, I think, a response to both the information revolution and to what you call Gen X, what I call the choice generation. And I think those two things go together. We have a generation of young people that have grown up in a very different world than the America of 20 years ago or even 100 years ago, when most of the ideas we have about government were formed. We as a generation, those of us who came of age in the 70s and 80s and 90s, grew up in a world where a few different things were happening. One, you had the force of technology come about. You have today's modern technologies, be they DVD players or the internet or personal computers or Palm Pilots, all of them really created in order to allow individuals to give their own values a response in the real world, to allow them to conform the world around them so that it fits their own personal needs and personalities and desires. We came of age at a time when modern companies really saw it as their job to do something that was literally unimaginable for companies a generation ago, taking their own power and giving it to their customers, giving their customers more choices, more decision-making power, more personalized services and products that they could fit to their own lifestyles. And it's bigger than just technology. I was in Boston this morning and stopped at a coffee shop that some of you might have visited. It's called Starbucks. You're going to see a few of those in Seattle. If you had walked into a coffee shop 20 years ago, you'd be lucky if somebody asked you if you wanted cream or sugar with your coffee. Today we live in an age of non-fat grande caramel mocha frappuccinos. We have this explosion of choices everywhere we look, whether it's turning on a television and going from 3 channels to 100 channels, whether we walk down a grocery store cereal aisle and see a whole variety of cereals that were unimaginable earlier on. Well, what does any of this have to do with politics? Well, it turns out that if you look at the course of American history, that government usually lags about 10, 15, 20 years behind changes in the economy. Not just changes in the economy of the kind of economy we learn about in Ec 10 or in an economics course, but the kind of economy that most people live in day by day, the types of workplaces they work in, the types of places they shop, the way they learn, the way they live in an everyday manner. And that economy does many things, but it also shapes people's perceptions. It shapes the way they look at the world. And today, we're used to, in many different fashions, looking at a world where we have a whole host of choices, decisions to make on a day-by-day basis. And this explosion of choices that I described is really present everywhere except for government. Because government is really running on an old business model. The one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter programs that came about because of the last revolution that hit the American economy, the Industrial Revolution. And then you had a generation similar to the generation of young people today that was called the generation of the progressives, people like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, who came about in a time when America was both affluent and a flux, when people thought that government didn't really matter anymore, where they thought that both political parties were outdated, where they thought that all the action was happening in the private sector. And what these people did, people like Teddy Roosevelt, people like Woodrow Wilson, a later generation, people like Franklin Roosevelt, they took what was happening in the private sector and applied those ideas to government. At the time, you had Henry Ford saying that you could buy his Model T in any color you wanted as long as it was black. And what this generation of people did was create government programs that were as one-size-fits-all as the one-size-fits-all products that were rolling off the assembly line. They made government as big and bureaucratic and bulky and centralized and hierarchical and regimented and expert-driven, all the things that Erin described in her introduction, all the factors that would describe the gleaming new economy of their own time. But of course, that's not the world we live in today, and so that disconnect is the one that I think that our generation faces. If this generation is saying to government, get real, I think it's in large part because we as a generation grew up in a very different world than the ideas that form the very basis of most of the government programs we see today. And I think that's really the fundamental disconnect we see facing our generation. And I think we as a generation have responded to it in many different ways. One is by opting out of government and instead focusing on community service. But I think things like that are a short-term solution. I think that government really needs to change fundamentally. And I think that's bigger than just a lot of what people talk about in terms of the information revolution. It's bigger than broadband regulation or putting government services online or computers in the classrooms or all the things people usually think about when they talk about how technology is going to change government. It's really not using the implements of technology as much as using the impetus of technology. Really changing government programs so they give people more choice, more decision-making power. Letting people choose what kind of schools they think are best for their children. Letting people choose how they save for their own retirement. Letting people choose what kind of healthcare plans and what kind of doctors they see. Letting people choose what kind of job training benefits they think are best for them. And a lot of the services the government provides, really transforming those services so that people themselves can make decisions for themselves, empowering individuals in a way that, unfortunately, neither political party is really talking about fully today. Many Republicans would just simply get rid of these services rather than change them so people have more choice, or they would offer choice to either the very few at the top in terms of health care, or the very few at the bottom in terms of education. And many Democrats, while I think a lot of Democrats are talking about these things, there's still many Democrats who see nothing wrong with government programs that don't give people much choice as long as they see them as providing the help that people need. I don't think that's enough in American politics, and I think that we do need a new way of thinking, and so that, to answer your question, is what the next deal is.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be a great deal. Meredith, how do we get ready for that in terms of issues? What do Gen Xers care about? They don't like politics, but they like the issues.
I think one of the things I wanted to talk about today is sort of three things that I've come up against in terms of the information age. And the first one does have to do with my book. And I spent sort of last year going out and trying to get people excited about voting and talking about the issues that are important to young Americans. And I was traveling around and talking to college campuses and trying to get people excited. And then November 7th came around. It was about a week before November 7th. And I said, gosh, I gotta get my absentee ballot. So I go online and thinking that everything is as easy as pie because I'm in the information age and I can shoot emails and I can get everything done immediately. I go online to Florida and I say, okay, well, what do I have to do? Turns out it's too late. It's like, you gotta be kidding me. I spent all year talking about the importance of voting and now I can't vote. So it's like, this is unacceptable. So I was like, well, I have the option, I can go home and vote. So Florida's an important state, I'll go home and do it. So I get on a plane and I go down to Florida, Palm Beach, my hometown. And I take my 88-year-old grandmother and we both go down to the voting booth and she sort of stumbles around and hits something. And then I go in and I say, oh, this is a little bit confusing, but I think I'm hitting the right button. And I do. So anyway, I mean, as it turns out, all of that effort for naught, my vote probably didn't get counted anyway. But that being said, how hard did I press? That being said, you know, and I stayed there and I watched it, and I watched people count, and I had a cousin who went in and counted all of those votes. And that whole experience really drove home to me how inaccessible our government is to us, and how backwards they are. I mean, we live in a world where 2 billion stocks are traded every day on the New York Stock Exchange. We live in a world where billions of emails are sent back and forth. We've got a lot of smart people out there. Why aren't we employing them to make government accessible and to employ the technology that we have in our everyday lives and to give it to voters and to citizens? And you ask, you know, what is one of the biggest problems to get young people to vote? I think the biggest problem is overcoming these hurdles, making it accessible. Let's start thinking about things like voting online. Let's think about electronic voting. Let's come up with a better method. I mean, for gosh sakes, the Russians are telling us how we should count ballots. They've got a better method. So you know, when a sort of a country whose economy is falling apart is telling us how to count, we certainly have problems. And so that was the first thing that really drove home to me. I think one of the second things, the second experience I had was with a group who was testifying to the Medicare Commission. And we had a series of economists come and talk about the future of Medicare and economic models. And they drew, you know, these pencil heads got up and they drew all these charts and only things, you know, Harvard undergraduate or economists can understand, right? And you know, these poor politicians are sitting there. Most of them don't have economics degrees. They're seeing all of these things being flailed about, and they're like, "My God, what do we do? What are you talking about? Give us the bottom line." Sort of at the end of the day, after 5 days of testimony, they didn't get it. I mean, they had no idea how to process this information. And I think that's the second problem, is that our politicians are so flooded with information. How do they make decisions? How do they choose the right gurus, the right economists? Who do they trust? And where do they find information? And I think that's the second problem. And then I think the third problem is something I came upon last week when I attended a technology conference out in Monterey. And this is the problem of how we make new legislation for the crazy, crazy things that are going to come. One MIT professor got up and he talked about haptics and how we're going to insert small computers, nanocomputers into people's heads, which will shut off their regular emissions, light and hearing, and replace it with what we want them to hear. So kind of creating a virtual world and plugging ourselves into a matrix. And granted, he's a little kooky, and that's not going to happen for a while, but those things are coming. And then there's another group of renegade scientists who are moving offshore to clone a human being. And those things are happening, and that technology exists. And the question is, you know, Andre was saying that government is 10 or 15 years behind, and I would agree with him, but I would say in the next 10 or 30 years, they may be 100 or 200 years behind information and technology and trying to keep up with the ethics that these things bring about. And so it's a great worry to me is how do we catch up and how do we tell politicians, how do we instruct ourselves as citizens and bring technology into government? And I think that's the most crucial thing, not only facing this generation, but facing the coming generation, is dealing with those ethical battles and figuring out what the right answer is. So.
On the question whether I'm Generation X or not, I would just say I wrote most of my papers at Harvard on a typewriter, and I think that answers your question. And I'm afraid that also I'm put in the position of sort of being the old voice and the government voice. And I guess I wanted to do three things. One, I agree totally with the premise, government has to change. I think there are two things to be careful about. The first thing is, as we talk about this premise of a generation of choice and that sort of thing, we can't forget that there is a digital divide, and there are a group of many, many people out there who are not afforded the kinds of choices. And we just, as we make the changes, we cannot exacerbate that divide. And the second thing, and you cover this in your book, Andre, which I think is vital, the sense of individualism and choice and having people operate on their own and be strong and compete, it cannot be without responsibility. A responsibility to community and patriotism and the things that are important as a nation. But let me go on to the two other things I was going to quickly cover. One is, what have we done? It is tough, but I thought it would be helpful. In the past 8 years, I've been in the Clinton administration, and there are some things that did happen. to move us along the way. Number one, when we got there were Wang computers at the State Department. To give you a sense of the equipment issue, and that is something that has moved, I think, pretty well. Second, we now have a site called FirstGov. And on that site, what was difficult was if you wanted to find out how many truck driving accidents there were, you had to know whether you should go to the Department of Transportation or should you go to OSHA to find out that statistic, because you couldn't search it by topic. What FirstGov is about is access of the information and creating a way where all you need to know is what do you want to know about. And that was a big step, and you can imagine with all the government information, very hard to coordinate. That is now up, not running perfectly, but going. Third, service. OMB, the M in OMB, Office of Management and Budget, runs something called the President's Management Committee. One of the things that we required was that every department put something up online, a service. And every department has them. If you're the Treasury Department, you have the IRS. Can you file electronically? If you're the SBA, you have services, loans. Put it up. Put something up. And to your point, Andre, the second thing we told them was, don't just think in terms of service. You have to pick one program and how can technology change it? Not just the service part of accessing it, but how could you use technology to provide better information, to understand loan rates, to do something? And that is something that's being worked on. Finally, the policy infrastructure. And the policy infrastructure, by that what I mean is there are some real challenges here, such as privacy, also security. And those have been worked on. And a couple of examples, when the I Love You virus hit, the federal government was not shut down, and it wasn't because of steps that had been taken. So the information spread very quickly. The chief information officers in their ARA group communicated immediately to all the departments, and we were not in a total gridlock. That day, nothing happened on my machine, and the virus, I got, someone sent it, but everyone knew before they opened. Second, privacy issues, and I think this group probably knows a little bit about legislation and things we've worked on, rules and that have gone out. The second thing I just want to briefly mention are the challenges. Yes, we have to do this, and I think we agree here, and the question is, how do you get there? And I think it's important just to articulate some of the challenges. First is security. Let me give you a specific example many of you all may know about. We have struggled long and hard on doing your student loan applications online. The problem is student loan applications require IRS information. In order to confirm, we need to know your parents' income. That's how we check if we need to check to make sure you're not lying about the income. The IRS has very careful protections, and I'm sure you can understand why. This generation of choice also believes in privacy and that sort of thing. If we go using the internet to get you to sign off to see your taxes or your parents' taxes, that's an issue. Trying to work through these security issues is a real challenge. And also, just across the board, in terms of our systems, our information technology, people getting in, and I have access to the National Security Council systems at OMB. What if you get in? What do you find out? Classified issues. Second is talent. We have to compete. At the Office of Personnel Management, we have set up special fellowships to get technology people into government. I mean, if you can go to a .com, you're graduating from college and you can go to a .com, or you can come to the federal government and help us. You can understand that problem. The final is a related problem, and that is that technology is generally not sexy. If I'm going into government, I am going to change the world, to change Bosnia policy, to either do a tax cut or not do a tax cut. So the people that are going into government, this is low. The senior people and the policy people, it's low. And finally, cost. This costs money. And when going to the Congress, when talking about this, it is not popular to spend money on department overhead. And that's what technology is. That is not a popular topic when you go before the United States Congress. Carol Browner's up here now and knows this better than anybody in terms of funding the EPA, getting technology. They're getting technology for the State Department. And on the Hill, it's sort of a related problem. Do folks really understand? And I just want to give you an example. OMB was called up for a hearing before the Information Technology Committee on the House side. The chairman of the committee said, "I'm pleased to welcome you today to a hearing on FirstGov.gov. I think that gives you a sense of the grasp that some folks have on these issues that we're trying to work through and fun. With that, I will stop. Sorry, Congressman Horn.
I think it is really good that Sylvia is here because she so rightly understands that she's sort of been cast as the government over here.
Luddite, as Andre would say in his
Right,
book.
the Luddite. And the reality is really just the opposite, and that Sylvia is, I mean, she was deputy or chief of staff of all these guys who are really running the place. And she understands, I think, better than anybody sort of where the rubber meets the road in this. I mean, if you sort of look up her back, there are all these skid marks wherever she got run over all the time. But Sylvia did do a terrific job, and people all around here have sort of talking about how she fundamentally understood the challenges out there in a way that a lot of people didn't. And I want to begin with just that question. What Andre in his book raised the question, and I want to raise it here: is the old order in crisis? Is our government today in a crisis in the sense of people running around, we have real problems, or is it sort of going to crunch down the road? Are we in a crisis today?
Yes and no is my,
It sounds like a politician, doesn't
is
it?
my strong answer. I'll give you both. I think we are in a crisis in certain senses. I think in many ways our education system is in a crisis. In many ways our retirement system is in a crisis with the future of Social Security and those types of questions. And so I think there are real crises going on. But for the broader question about whether government is in a crisis, I think it's a slow motion crisis. When I talk in the book about the crisis of the old order, I'm quoting from a book Arthur Schlesinger wrote about the Great Depression and the New Deal. And that really was, that book he wrote is about what happened before the New Deal hit, before the Great Depression hit. And I think in many ways that's, though not always, hopefully, certainly where we are in the course of American politics. I think that we're at a point where a lot of the basic thinking about government that's really held true for 100 years no longer seems to fit for people. And that both political parties really don't have much of a positive agenda, either sort of have nostalgic appeals to, tax cuts for the Republicans or sort of, big social programs for Democrats, that neither of which really sell much with the American people. And that's really where we were in an earlier period. What happened in the 1920s and early part of the 1930s was that it took a real crisis. It took the Great Depression to happen before government finally changed, before we built the New Deal programs that really have done so much good for the country, really, and have really been such a positive achievement for the American century. And I think so the test for our generation is whether we can actually sort of avert the crisis, whether we can sort of use the intellectual crisis as a means for changing government before we have a real live crisis that calls into question a lot of the fundamental challenges that America faces in the coming years. I think we've gone a long way towards doing that. I think Sylvia's description of what the Clinton administration did was exactly right, and I think they actually did even more on an intellectual level. I think that in many ways Bill Clinton in his presidency was a lot like Teddy Roosevelt in certain senses, that he was able to basically say to the country, the old ways of thinking about government aren't going to work anymore. Teddy Roosevelt was, of course, a Republican in a time where Republicans had controlled thinking about government for about 50, 60 years. Bill Clinton is a Democrat at a time when Democrats have really controlled most of American thinking about government for the past 50 or 60 years. But both of them said the government's really not going to work any longer in its old capacity, and it really needs to change. And they left it, in both cases, I think, to future people to figure out what exactly those changes are. So I think that that's really where we are in the stage of the crisis. But I think, once again, the real crisis might still be averted.
Sylvia, you have been in the middle, from the epicenter, from the inside. Does it look like a crisis from inside?
I think I would probably answer that question. No, it's not a crisis, but we ought to act like it is. And by that, let me give you a pretty specific example. Y2K, I would say, is the perfect example of, we actually didn't have a crisis. You know, we were building up 2 years ahead. We put in place the mechanisms and everybody was like, oh my goodness, we are going to have a huge problem and we are going to have a crisis. So we all acted like we were about to have a crisis. And with that came many things, and whether it was the investments we did in the departments to improve their technology. And you know, Social Security checks went out. All the checks went out. All the systems kept going. The FAA could run. Everything did happen, but that was 2 years in coming because we thought there might be a crisis. So that's what I mean when I say we should act like it. And also, one of the things that came out of that I think was very important is the relationships that were built with industry. The government's anxiety, the federal government's anxiety, forced state and local governments to make sure their grids were working, whether it's your local electricity or whatever. Local mayors and that sort of thing. But it also led to relationships with the banking industry, with the telecommunications industry, and others to make sure that we were all on the same page. And hopefully those are things that can be leveraged as we try and move forward. So no, but we ought to act like it.
Anybody got any questions? Just raise your hand or come to a mic. Somebody jumped off the stage back there. You're anxious. You must have a great question.
For merit.
I don't think it's a great question. It's a stream of ideas.
Identify yourself. Tell us who you
Hi,
are.
I'm Amy. I'm a graduate student in medical anthropology. Anyway, two things. Firstly, I think the last question was framed so much from the inside of government, but yet at the same time, it's obviously the federal government, and I feel very much that local government isn't represented here. And it's precisely at the level of local government that I wanted to ask my question about virtual town halls. Virtual town halls and what you think about participation online. I'm more interested in the transnational aspect of this, but as far as participation goes and this new idea about choice, is this interesting to Generation X? This makes me feel quite old, actually, just listening for some reason. But is that an interesting thing, a virtual town hall? From what I understand internationally about the statistics and around internet use, politics is just not interesting, even on the internet. So I mean, this is just some market research thing that I've read. So on the one hand, the question's about local government and participation. On the other hand, it's about funding and this all kind of, with all the talk about choice, it points to this idea that maybe how are we going to deal with this, or the question, how are we going to deal with this information overload, and are best practice models the thing of the future? That's kind of,
I think
did you?
Yeah, that's obviously Meredith.
I think what's interesting is I actually read a study that came out right before the election, and it showed, and I wish I could remember the name, but it showed that Generation X, being 18 to 24, would be much more likely to vote if they could vote online. And I think what's interesting about that, I mean, it's my personal example too, which is this, that it doesn't seem right that you have to jump over all of these hurdles in order to vote. It should be as easy as clicking on, and we should be smart enough to make it secure and available to do that. And so I think that eliminating those barriers for this age group is crucial. We're not an age group that responds to sort of mass mailings. We're not an age group that responds, that even lives in one place sometimes more than a year. And it's hard to even know where you should register. I've lived in like 3 or 4 different cities in the last 2 years of my life. So it's hard for this generation. I think we do need the idea of the internet and technology in order to help us to vote. And I think you said virtual town hall meetings. And I think, did you have something else?
Well, it was just the idea, I mean, voting, to say that participation is not just every 4 years or in these elections.
Yeah,
So really, you could
absolutely.
get at that idea of participation.
Absolutely. And we're all around, all of the organizations like Rock the Vote or MTV's Choose or Lose or all of the, or Project Vote 2000 are around nonstop every year, whether there's an election or not. And it is a process that needs to be fostered at a very young age and every year. And if we could, I think what's another interesting statistic about this age group is that we volunteer more than any other age group around. And that if you can take that idea of volunteering, and I think the reason we do it is because we see results. Reading to a kid or teaching a class makes you feel good, makes you feel like you've done something. Voting doesn't make you feel like you've done anything. I mean, especially in this last election. And I think that if we can put a connection and say, look, voting is important, civic participation is important, and it makes a difference, and we can make the connection with people, they will join in the process.
Can I suggest to you, just you referred to the transnational aspect of this. Take a look at a guy named Andre Santini. He's the mayor of this little suburban area of Paris called Issy-Moulinet. And he has the whole city council meetings are interactive. They're on the net. They, every 20 minutes, I think, they stop the official proceedings and have discussions online. They respond to questions, and then they pick up again, and they keep going. And sometimes these things last 4 and 5 and 6 hours, but they're terribly interesting in terms of a new model of civic participation.
A couple of quick things. One on the local thing, you're absolutely right, because most people just want to get their driver's license over the net. You know, those are the things. One thing that is happening there are actually private sector companies. I can't remember, GovWorks, I think, .com. There are a number that have been set up that are actually going into mayors and saying, we're going to get you so that they have access. And the local stuff is very important because I think it's many people's day-to-day interaction with government and their impression. Second, on the question of town halls, both international and domestically, the president in going abroad has done them internationally when he goes abroad. He has done them before. And in the past 2 years, I actually was the first person to do an interactive town meeting after the State of the Union, and I don't remember which year it was. I was our guinea pig. So I go online at midnight. You know, it's midnight because by this time, you know, the president, our State of the Union's kind of last a while, and by the time I come back. So I go on, and totally there were people there. They were asking questions, lots and lots of them. It was going on, and it was real-time, you know, response. And after that time, both the president and the vice president both participated in what I guess you'd call a town meeting because everybody can see the answers, you know, the questions and the answers. So it is as interactive as this in terms of the information being spread. So I think it is something that will grow. And it worked. And I found the questions very substantive. And the people that were asking the questions obviously had knowledge. A level of knowledge that was, you know, they were interested enough to be asking questions about the State of the Union and the budget at midnight.
Yeah.
My name.
Hang on, just have a second.
Answer that question really quickly, because I think it's a very good question. I think that technology actually can, in many ways, be a source of the reflowering of democracy in really fundamental ways, and I think even more fundamental ways than virtual town halls, which I think are really good and important. You know, I think that in some ways we've, over the past 200 years, because of barriers of knowledge and distance and communications and information and so on, had this idea of democracy in America where democracy means casting a vote or for an elected official or letting an elected official know your opinion and then having them make decisions. And that's certainly, you know, a key part of the American democratic system. But I think that really partially because of technology and partially because of the way technology affects the way people see the world, democracy can actually be something bigger today. Democracy, which is, of course, the people ruling themselves, can be actually something that happens every day with people making decisions about their own schools and their own retirement and their own health care and all the things that government impacts them on so regularly. And so because of technology and because of the way of looking at the world that technology fosters, I think that actually we can have a real sort of renewal of the idea of what democracy can really be.
Question.
My name's Eugene Krupitsky, and I'm a junior at the college. In all of your remarks, it seems as if there are two ideas that came out that, when synthesized, can cause a very serious problem. One is the thing that Sylvia hit on, which is this idea of the people that are currently in government don't really understand the internet and lots of the technology that is currently being implemented everywhere else. The other idea is that our generation is much more involved in community action and less involved in politics. So you have this concept of people that are currently involved will continue to remain involved because we don't want to get involved. And it seems as if there are sort of two ways it can work itself out. One is that it'll naturally work itself out. These people we'll move on, and eventually people from our generation will come into those roles and become senators and congressmen. The other one is through this idea of choice, that Americans, because they are choice-oriented, will force government to change. And I was wondering which one of those two you would see happening first.
I think the second one is in my mind more likely. I don't really believe that when we as a generation get a few more gray hairs and settle down and start having kids, that we're going to start voting more. I don't think that any of the numbers that I've seen out there really show that. I think that we have a real fundamental disconnect from government that won't just be solved by the normal aging process and the normal process of settling down. There's an interesting poll, and I don't have the exact number, so I'll make some up, but which basically says that young people, people 30 and under, were asked, do you refer to it as the government or our government? And the majority of them referred to it as the government. Voters over 65 asked that same question, said it's our government. Now that's partially because they've had good experiences with government in terms of the New Deal and World War II and places where government actually made a big difference. But I think it's also because government really runs on the ideas of that generation, for better or worse. It runs on the ideas that came out of the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s, and that those ideas don't really seem relevant to our generation anymore. As Meredith was pointing out, we're not really an apathetic generation, we're really an active generation that's opted out of government because we don't get results and because government doesn't really seem to fit the world we live in. And so I think that one of the big challenges we face, and I think you hit on it, is really that we're in a bit of a vicious circle. That I don't really think government is going to change until we as a generation get involved and bring our own values and insights to the fore. But I think we're going to have a hard time convincing our generation to get involved until government changes. And so somehow somebody's going to have to come along to break that knot. And I think that's really one of the challenges that's ahead of us.
Are either party any better? Are Democrats any better? Republicans any better? National, local? Or is it just all a bunch of white guys in black suits? Yes, everybody. Excuse me, your suit is, there are a few white women around.
I think that's a tough question. I mean, I think that the Democrats, to a certain extent, do a good job in some areas, and the Republicans do a good job in other areas. And I mean, I think the example there is Democrats tend to visit college campuses more. They tend to be friendly towards the environment. They tend to be friendly towards being socially liberal, which I think are things that appeal to this generation. On the other hand, the Republicans appeal in the sense that they provide choice in terms of perhaps Social Security accounts or Medicare. They seem to be more fiscally responsible, whatever that means. And I think in that sense, they appeal to this generation. So I think that they appeal in different ways, but I think that the thing that brings them together and the commonality and where they appeal is the thing that Andre's been talking about, and that is the idea of choice and the idea of freeing up this clutch that the government, or we perceive that the government has on our lives, and trying to allow people to have more power over their own lives in terms of where their money goes, in terms of who they can marry, in terms of what school their child can go to. So I think it is about providing choice, and they're both edging towards it in different ways, and in ways that they can feel comfortable with. But in my estimation, it's got to go faster in order for this generation to be engaged at an early enough level.
Sylvia and I are sitting here both thinking the same thing. Are you guys going to say that's okay when your IRA goes through the floor and you got no Social Security?
Totally. On the choice thing, and this is, again, that, let's just say we had a system where you controlled all of your retirement accounts. And let's say today you turned 65. In the past year, the value of your account has gone to 10% of what it was a year ago today. Now, I'm really sorry, but you're not going to be eating in the month of August. Unless we do one of two things. Oh, we could raise everybody's taxes. Now, that's good. I don't think so. Or, I mean, that's on the choice thing, and that's, I guess, what I'm saying. yes, we have to move to it, but you really have to think through the ramifications of some of these things with regard to choice. And I guess the second thing is it's to the point that Andre said, and I guess the answer to Eugene's question in my mind of which is going to be the solution, the answer to which way it will be is in this room. It is the people in this room. It is the people in this school. It's the undergraduates at Harvard College. It is the people in all the universities. That's why I'm here for 2 weeks. I'm here for 2 weeks so I can at least hopefully convince people of two things. One, in government you can affect change. You know what? I actually tutored for my first 4 years, and then I couldn't anymore during the time. And it was a discussion that I would have, and actually even had with Secretary Rubin, about the marginal value of my time with regard to the hour. And it was just an hour, so it wasn't really a fruitful discussion. It was worthwhile for me personally. So, but the question of you can affect change in government, number one. And second, we're not a bunch of yahoos. People in government are not all crazy, and we're not all there because of our own promotion. I mean, Carol is here too, and Carol. That's true, but it just is just to tell people, because I agree, the circle's somebody's got to stop the circle, but you all are part of that.
Andre?
On the second point, I couldn't agree more, and I think there's no better example of that possibility other than Sylvia Matthews, who has done so much good over the past 8 years and really had such a huge impact on so many issues, and has won praise and plaudits, and still has not been praised enough for all the stuff that she's done. So I think it's clear that people though she may deny it now, at a relatively young age, can get very involved and actually have a big impact. I'll disagree with her on her first point, though, which is the Social Security point. I don't think anybody's really talking about transferring money for people who are about to turn 65. What most of the ideas are, at least the ideas that I support, are talking about people who are entering the workforce now, people in their 20s and 30s. And it's pretty clear that over any 30-year period in American history, stock markets go up and down, but you clearly end up at a lot higher point 30 years later than you do at the beginning of period of that change. So even if you were turning 65 now, your stocks would be down from where they were in 1999, but they'd sure be up from where they were in 1970 when you started investing.
Not if you buy Microsoft and Cisco today.
Well,
anyway,
I think even aside from that, I think that we as a generation are willing to accept a little bit more risk than previous generations. I think that much is clear. You had Franklin Roosevelt say that most people just can't really invest for themselves. Unless you have a stockbroker, you shouldn't be making decisions for yourself in the stock market. And that idea is just foreign to people today when you have a lot of people investing for themselves. You've had an explosion in people investing. It's gone from somewhere about 28% in 1990 to more than 50% now of people investing in the stock market, people really at all income levels. Not all, I mean, certainly it's still weighted towards the rich, which is why I think that something like Social Security reform, which would let people who can invest for themselves have their own nest egg, is important. Let me just, talking about the risk and Sylvia's example, let me just say one thing, which is there was a TV commercial last year for E-Trade, and some of you may have seen it. This was a commercial, the Mr. Dinky commercial. A guy is sitting in his cubicle at the office, is investing online, invests in Acme Widget Company or something like that, and his stock goes through the roof. He runs out of his cubicle, tears down the hallway, kisses his coworker, runs up to his boss's office, throws open the door and says, "Mr. Dinky, I quit." He gets back to his office cubicle, refreshes his web browser, and sees that his stock has plummeted and that he's lost everything. The strange thing is this is a commercial for investing online, not against it. I think at a fundamental level, it's about wealth creation, certainly, but it's also about an expectation that people have, people from all walks of life, that they will have the ability to control their own destiny in a really fundamental way.
Just one small thing on the policy, because I know we don't want to, but I think it is an important thing. It's like most things. There is a place to go, and the place I believe to go is a place where you do have individual savings accounts that encourage savings that people can invest, but you still maintain Social Security. It's the plan we proposed. yes, let's get some of that money in higher earning things, and let's give dollars to people who can't save and let them put it in, but let's not take the entire Social Security system, because if,
I
no
agree with that.
matter what happens, if the down occurs at a particular point, you could end up getting very hurt. So I believe there are solutions, and that's what, working through in government should be doing, is working to solutions
with that as well.
move us to choice, but protect us from the downside.
Let me go to Carol Browner, one of the fine inside the government for 8 years.
That's right.
Ran EPA and did it
Thank you.
every day when you drink your water and it's a little cleaner and the air is a little cleaner. You should thank this lady right here.
Thank you. I couldn't contain myself, having done the forum on many occasions. On that side, I thought, oh, gee, I could actually ask a question. I could do it from this side. And the question I have for all of you as we try and bring the government into the modern technology world, how do we protect against political gamesmanship? And let me share with you 2 experiences. As the head of one of the large government agencies, 18,000 employees, $7 billion, in 8 years, I never once turned on my email. I never once communicated with my colleagues at the EPA via email. The reason is that everything I touched as the administrator of the EPA was subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Now, for most people, email is sort of replaces the hallway chat in many instances. The last thing I wanted to do was find sort of my reminiscence on early thoughts on what pollution standard we might set on SUVs in litigation against some company. So I never once turned on my email. I believe in the Freedom of Information Act. I believe it's a valuable tool. I believe that people should have a right to know what their government is doing. But how do we deal with that fundamental right and yet allow government to modernize? I'll give you the second example. When I came to EPA 8 years ago, we had a nice website. It got 500,000 visits a month, 500,000. By the time I left EPA, we had grown it significantly, to the consternation of some in industry. We were making more information available about their pollution levels. To the consternation of some in government at the state and local level, we were making information available about the air pollution. We were making information available about beach closures. By the time I left, we had 100 million hits a month on that site. We went from 500,000 to 100 million, clearly demonstrating that the public wants access to their government. About a year before I left, we briefed members of the Hill, their staff, on firewalls that we were installing because we carry sensitive government information, not top secret or anything, but certainly information that doesn't necessarily belong in the public domain without some sort of explanation. 24 hours after we gave this briefing, the chairman of a committee announced that EPA was vulnerable to hackers. We had to shut down in 30 minutes our site. It is as if a bullseye had been planted on our back, telling the world we were vulnerable to hackers. This person was well aware of the firewalls we were installing. They were in advance of what most government agencies were doing. It was a political agenda. He didn't like our site. He didn't like the information we were making available to citizens. And so my question to you all is, as the government reaches out and uses these technologies to engage the public in its work, how do we prevent against political gamesmanship?
Oh, let's all jump in and take that one.
It is what is going on. It means government is constrained.
Can I suggest to you that in one very real sense, the answer is you can't. I mean, we had the rumors, and I mean, I grew up in the Deep South. Y'all all figured that out pretty quick, right? Well, in this last election, I was getting emails talking about the race of John McCain's child and speculating on why he had a black baby. Well, it's the same thing that George Wallace did. It's the same thing that they did in 1876 during Redemption. It was the same thing, et cetera, et cetera. They just did it by email. So, I mean, in the one sense, I think it's sort of politics on the web by other means, but you can't get around it.
Although I would say the one thing I would say, and I'll actually offer, although I think it's very hard, one thing that's different is the kind of information that we're talking about. I mean, we're talking about, on on the EPA website and the type of information she's talking about. I mean, a terrorist could go and, knowing where toxic sites are, or I guess that stuff is not.
You can go to your local library
Yeah.
and get the list of toxic waste
But
sites.
it makes it much
Web.
easier, doesn't it? Do you think it's more dangerous?
No, I mean,
Like,
I
that
think
would
that
be the
if we
question.
honestly, this was a big debate over the last several years between a variety of government agencies and the Congress, and this sense that somehow or another we should limit the public's right to know about dangers in their communities and the plans for dealing with those dangers. For example, chemical plants are required to have emergency response plans. And this is a good thing. You want them to think through what happens if something blows up so that they can take the steps to prevent additional injury in the community. There were some who suggested that by putting that information into the public domain via the web, you were enhancing the ability of a terrorist to access the information. Now, everyone agreed we should put the information in a public library. I don't know any terrorists. I've never met a terrorist, I presume. But my suspicion is if they are hell-bent on doing something, they will go to the public library. And that, in fact, the benefit of communities, of citizens around a facility knowing that these plans have been produced, knowing what these plans are, far outweigh whatever ease there may be for the terrorists. They can get around the problem if it's not on the internet.
I guess, too, to answer the question, like, what should we do? And I think there was the first part, which is the communication and the FOIA issues. And I think the only thing to do is just decide if you're willing to, it's very hard, I know, to separate what you're willing to write emails about and not, so that you could use it some. It sounds like you weren't able to use it at all, and the subpoenas you all suffered from.
Or you could change the Freedom of Information Act.
Which I don't think is a potential solution. I think it just becomes harder on the people who are communicating, and we all did suffer from that slightly less when you're in the White House, because FOIA doesn't apply, which is an interesting dynamic, so we could communicate more freely than the departments. On the second question of the politics, FOIA does apply, but with more limitations is probably a better way to put it. On the second part about how do you stop the political gamesmanship, how do you stop the member from going out and saying that, I think unless there is a price to pay, creating a price to pay, and one of the things that I think we need to do is, this is a place where I think that the media can be helpful to us if they choose to. That kind of thing can be damaging if it happens, but it's sometimes very hard to make that newsworthy. And then the other thing is, what are we going to do? Make it newsworthy that a congressman did this to us so that additional people know. And so you get in a bit of a bind there. But it is, maybe that is a way.
Question.
Nico Cornell, freshman at the college. There's been so much talk about choice and how it's politically empowering and giving people all this so much more liberty. And I'm just a little bit curious how that can be a bad thing as well, and what the government can do to restrict it. Like, I think you could draw a parallel in terms of just not information technology, but with like weapons. Now criminals have the choice between an AK-47 and the old-fashioned pistol, and the government has to do stuff to kind of adapt to that and restrict that liberty. And I think the same thing happens with information. I recall a website that explained how you build a bomb and then listed off abortion clinic like addresses. And I just kind of am curious what you think the role of the government is to restrict the new choices that are coming in, because I think a lot of them have the potential to be dangerous at the same time as empowering.
How does it restrict?
I think that's right, and I think that you're conditioned, especially if you listen to television a lot or you listen to our corporations, that choice equals good. Choice is always a good thing. You go to Starbucks, you get lots of choices. You go into a department store, you get lots of choices, and sort of our consumer culture sort of frames us into believing that choice is a good thing. And I think you're absolutely right. There's times when choice isn't necessarily a good thing. Giving children, semi-automatic weapons access, they have the choice to use it. It's not a good thing. Likewise, do we allow couples to choose to clone themselves? There are so many choices that we can have, and technology just expands that range of choices. And the trick is trying to figure out where to draw the line. And you can only sort of go back to the philosophers and say, well, you can have as much choice until it harms somebody else. And that's a very broad guideline, but it's the only one that I sort of know of to sort of guide us in a sense, so that we try to have as much choice and give people as much individual freedom as we can, as long as that freedom doesn't start to impinge on somebody else's freedom in terms of their health, their well-being. And where do you draw that line? And I think it's a delicate balance, and it's one that we're always struggling with. And I think it becomes even more important, given the range of technologies that we now have, to manipulate life, to manipulate information, to manipulate weapons, that it becomes a crucial debate, I think, and one which I think, I don't know, Andre can also speak to, because that's what his book is about.
Well, yeah, as I define choice in my book, I'm talking about it specifically in terms of my proposals, in terms of the areas where people really don't have any choice today. There's the part of my book that's in favor of giving AK-47s to children is a very short part. But I'm talking about poor and middle-class families in this country who don't have any choice about their children's schools, who don't have any choice about retirement, who don't have any choice about health care, who don't have the same basic choices that the wealthiest and luckiest in this country enjoy. And so in that sense, yes, there are certainly, choice itself is not a good, but when you don't have any choices, when you're stuck in a system that is either not working or just doesn't respond to the way you look at the world, that's a fundamentally bad thing. But your point is right, and Sylvia, said this very correctly before, which is that choice in and of itself is not enough, that you need a balance, and that's something that's clear, that if we are going to give people all these new choices in terms of these programs I'm talking about, we have to, insist that they do make these choices, insist that they make them responsibly, and insist that they make them in a way that looks out not just for themselves, which is important, but also for the greater good. And so that sort of public insistence, and there's a number of things the government can do to make that possible is important. But along with individual power has to come more individual responsibility as well.
I'm told we're about to get to Hook here, so one more question from the floor.
Hi, I'm Michael Pasanti. I'm a joint law school, Trinity School student. I used to hang out at the IOP around here with Andre as an undergrad. My mother is a third grade school teacher in New Jersey, and for the first time this year they're introducing a computer into the classroom, and she has to learn how to use it, so she enlisted my help over spring break and last year, and it was real bad. I mean, she was like, what's a web page? How does all this work? And you guys are concerned, are sort of young, well-educated, technology-savvy people concerned that government is not going to sort of keep up with young people here. And I share that concern, but I'm also concerned that if government moves too fast in the direction that you want it to move, that it's going to leave the majority of people in this country behind, because the majority of the people here still aren't that technology savvy. I mean, I can't picture my mother ever wanting to file her tax form online, and I think my father would find an online town hall meeting incredibly depersonal and horrible. And I guess what I'm asking for is some concrete ways that government can prevent that from happening while it is moving into this information technology revolution.
My father is a fourth grade teacher in Los Angeles who still has not been able to figure out how to use email. And when my mom asked me for my email address, and they're both obviously very intelligent people, but still I'm trying to explain to her what the @ sign is in my email address, so has not been able to communicate that effectively. Yeah, as I said at the very beginning, what I'm talking about and what I think is important is I don't really think that government services online is really that important. I don't think that's really what people are looking for that much. I don't think that's really what our generation or really people all around the country are looking for. What they are looking for, however, is the same sort of freedoms that they have, and the internet is one small part of that, in the rest of services, in their basic ways that they interact every single day. Now, certainly technology is going to be part of that. And I'm not against putting government services online. I think it's a very good thing as long as there's other ways to access those things as well. But I don't think that in and of itself is enough. I think we are acceleratingly moving towards a system where more and more people are having access to these services. The digital divide that Sylvia spoke of is very real, but I think through a combination of government action and private actions of the smarter companies that are out there, we're seeing that 10 years down the road, hopefully, if everything goes according to the trends we're seeing now, it's not going to be as much of a problem as it is now. Your mother, has now gone online. My father's moving towards that. 10 years down the line, if we see the same sort of growth we've seen in the internet's going to be as universal as a television or a telephone is in most households. And so the question is, what really do we use that technology for? I think services online is important, but I think we can also use it to have something bigger and more ambitious. Using the information and using all of the types of things that Carol Browner was speaking about in a whole range of different government services, using that as a tool to give people basic choices and decision-making power that they just today don't have.
Once we get online, I hope when it becomes universal, I hope somebody will figure out how to keep the little numbers blinking on the VCR. They still hadn't figured out how to do that. Let me exercise the moderator's prerogative and ask all of you one last question. What's your favorite success story? What's working? What's great? What's wonderful? What is the one example that you know of that you can say, here is a great success that gives me great optimism and excitement that what we're talking about really is going to make a difference and make life better for real people. Sylvia?
I think the Y2K effort and what it can mean for that there is a possibility here that government can get it together when faced with something.
I think for me, it's one of the things that government is most in control of, and that is education. And had a small success with a class of junior high school kids when I went into the school, one of my old schools, and we had sort of a little debate tournament about the issues and getting them excited and seeing that politics is something that affects them. And I think that if you can replicate those kind of experiences at a young level in junior high and high school, and you can get people excited about government, and especially people our age and younger excited about government, to go in, to be smart, to get educated about the technology that's coming down the pipeline, and to get them ready to make the decisions that need to be made. I think that's the greatest success that we can have.
Andre?
I'll give you two. One, I think, is the charter school movement in the country. Places where we're really seeing this idea of giving parents choices, of having different way of thinking about government in a way that's a lot more flexible, yet more accountable, is really working in some of the worst off areas of the country. We're seeing some remarkable success stories spring about, and I think that really is in many ways sort of a grassroots indication of the type of government we're going to see in the future. So that's sort of on the choice side. On the responsibility side, I'm just saying this because I went there today and really came away very inspired. I went to City Year, which is of course, very inspirational service program here in Boston that's now all over the country in 13 different cities. And they're doing some remarkable things, bringing people together from all walks of life, from all backgrounds, in ways that they're really doing a lot of good for the communities in all the places they're serving, but also a lot of good for the people who are doing that. And that sort of idea of citizen re-engagement and using government as a catalyst to bring people together in citizen action that makes a real difference, I think, is one of the key chances we have for a better tomorrow.
And I'm going to just say, I think the most interesting, exciting, and optimistic piece of all this is these three characters. I mean, these are the kind of folks who can make a difference. I think Andre's sort of probably written more books in the last month than I've read. These folks are the ones who are making the difference, and they are crafting the ideas and the visions and actually doing it in the real world in a way that makes people's lives different, particularly with Sylvia down there. So I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank the folks here, and I want to invite you to join us. It's your choice, but invite you over to the IOP conference room, for a little reception after we get through around to the right. So thank you, and we appreciate you joining us.